So you can't differentiate between somebody who's newly arriving and somebody who might have been here for 10 years and has gone to visit their nan and is coming back again at the border. Does that mean you equally won't be able to differentiate when it comes to employment? So does that mean that until the settled status scheme is fully in place and fully rolled out, even in the event of no deal, there will be no change to employment rules or restrictions for newly arriving EU citizens?
So in any transition period, and I do think it's important that we are not placing new burdens on employers, traders, etc. in a transition period, it will be, as I've said, impossible to differentiate between somebody who has been here and not yet applied for settled status and somebody who has just arrived. So that's why we have set out the importance of a transition period and want to make sure through our citizens' rights deal that we get those rights conferred on EU cits who are going to apply for settled status and be entitled to it as effectively and efficiently as possible.
So are you saying that effectively you will apply a transition period even if there is no deal?
So I think we have to have a realistic period in which we allow employers, etc., to adjust.
Is there any way for employers to adjust in advance of the settled status scheme being fully in place?
To adjust to who they're allowed to employ and who not. Yeah. I mean, we, as you may know, bringing on stream the employer's digital right to work check, which obviously will be a useful tool in due course for those who go through the settled status.
But what would they be checking if somebody hasn't got their settled status in place yet?
So, I mean, the reality is that we have 3.5 million EU citizens who we are determined to protect the rights of. And so it is likely that there will be a period during which it is impossible for employers to differentiate between them and somebody who is newly arrived. But it's important that for all those who are here for more than 3 months, they will be required to register and go through the mandatory registration scheme so that once they've been here for 3 months, it will be possible for somebody to differentiate.
But in practice, in terms of the requirements on employers, those requirements on employers to differentiate between those who have settled status and those who newly arrived isn't likely to happen until the end of an equivalent transitional period to the one that you've got in place if there is a deal.
Well, the new arrivals, if they're planning on staying for 3 months, will be required to go through the mandatory registration process, which will be a mechanism which would enable employers to check. But we would hope that employers would make sure that they were employing people who were had the right to work, who they could verify via the employer's digital check. But what I'm very conscious of is that this provokes an enormous challenge for those who have already been here but yet not completed the settled status scheme, but we want to protect their rights.
But if there's no deal, this time next year, will an employer be expected to do a digital check on a French citizen, for example, who they want to employ, or will they just be able to carry on as they would at the moment?
Well, we expect employers to do right-to-work checks, and indeed, British citizens will ask to see their birth certificate, passport, or some other form of ID to check that they are indeed.
Okay, so suppose somebody shows their French passport and they're applying for a job this time next year and there's been no deal. When they show their French passport, will that be sufficient for them to be able to get a job, or will there be some additional check that the employer will be expected to do if there's no deal?
So we would expect the employer to make sure that they were behaving within the law. We would expect an individual to have gone through the mandatory registration scheme if they were planning to be here for more than 3 months.
But would the employer have to check that they've been through the mandatory registration scheme?
Well, the employer, as part of the right to work check, we expect employers to make sure that they are not employing people who don't have the right to work here.
But yeah, I'm still confused, because let's suppose actually this French citizen has been here for 10 years. So they won't have gone through the mandatory registration scheme. They may well not have filled in the settled status forms yet, because they've so far been told they've got some extra time to do that. How does the employer tell the difference between somebody who's newly arrived and who needs a mandatory registration form and somebody who's lived here for 10 years and who has a right to work but hasn't filled in the settled status form yet?
Well, in those circumstances, and we have, as part of our planning for the settled status scheme, factored in that there may indeed be pressures around employers, around the DWP, around access to other services, and at various points during the scheme we would anticipate there to be upticks in the number of people going through the process, and for some there may be a significant time pressure. So if, for example, you had applied for a new job, we're anticipating those to make contact and go through the settled status scheme, but for them obviously there'll be a time pressure because they'll want to be able to evidence to their employer that they have the right to be here. But you are absolutely right to point out that somebody who has been here for 10 years and has simply not yet been through the scheme, it will be almost impossible for an employer to differentiate between them and somebody who's a new arrival.
So if that's the case, what then will the government's position be? Will the government choose a requirement on employers to check that mandatory registration, in which case there's a risk that somebody who's been here for 10 years could face discrimination because they can't prove that? Or will the government choose to say, actually, we're not going to make it a requirement to assess mandatory registration?
We have always said that when it comes to the settled status scheme, we're going to adopt a pragmatic approach and make sure that any enforcement regime is not overly rigorous in any earlier period, because we're quite clear that this is absolutely one of the conundrums that employers will face, that we might expect the health service to face, is that there will be people who have rights under the agreement and under the settled status scheme, but haven't yet gone through the process to be able to evidence that.
Sure, but that's about whether or not the government is enforcing this or not. What are you expecting on an employer? Is the employer going to have to check the mandatory registration this time next year or not?
The mandatory registration scheme doesn't confer on somebody a right to work, and it's really the Prime Minister has been very clear that free movement ends when we leave the EU. So somebody who is coming here from the EU for more than a visit will have to go through the normal immigration scheme that we are going to bring forward, the future one, so that they have the right to work for a period in the UK.
Okay, I understand what you just said about free movement ending, but if there is no deal, you've already said that it's not going to make any difference to who will come through the border and any additional checks that they'll face. I'm still struggling to understand, this time next year, as opposed to in 5 years' time, but this time next year, will there be any change to who has a right to work here or not?
Yeah, because we'll have brought forward the future immigration system, and EU citizens will not have an automatic right to work in the UK unless they have been through the same processes that we're going to apply to the rest of the world.
But you just said that employers aren't going to be able to tell the difference.
So, and I've said that it's going to be an enormous challenge for both employers and for EU citizens who do have the right to work to make sure that we get them through the settled status scheme as efficiently as we possibly can, which is why we opened it up to private beta testing over the summer, that's why phase 2 opens in November. We know that it's a huge challenge, but there is absolutely going to be a difficulty to differentiate between those who have been here and not been through the process and those who have come as visitors and then seek to work. But,
so it's unworkable then?
Well, it's not unworkable, is it? Because we are going to make sure that by the end of the transition period we have 3.5 million or so EU citizens through the settled status who will be able to evidence digitally their right to be here.
Process.
Yeah, but we are very conscious.
Time next year.
We are very conscious that this is an enormous challenge, and the question is, do you wish us to discriminate against those EU citizens who have absolutely every right to be here and work? Or shall we have a pragmatic approach and make sure that we implement a system as part of our future immigration system whereby EU citizens who are coming here for more than a visit have to go through the same processes as everybody else?
Okay, I'm just still really baffled. I understand that there's a time at the end of a transition period, whether there's no deal or not no deal, whether there's a deal or no deal, at the end of the transition period you can bring in new rules. I'm just trying to work out what happens this time next year. So it would have been within the transition period if there was a deal, but if there is no deal this time next year, you have rightly and understandably said you do not want any discrimination against EU citizens who have lived here for very many years but who have not yet filled in their settled status. What I'm asking you then is, why and how do you think you can then have different rules that will apply to new arrivals, people who've just come after March 2019, when employers can't differentiate between them?
Well, because we're going to have to implement a future immigration system that reflects that we've ended free movement.
By this time next year?
Well,
If there is no deal.
not by this time next year, but we will be on the process to having implemented we will have ended free movement, so people coming here from the EU will have to go through a mandatory registration scheme, but we have to make sure that we have a future immigration scheme that can differentiate between the two. But I think we've been perfectly clear, there are going to be challenges during the transition period.
So either you're going to have a system that in practice is unworkable because employers can't implement it, or you're going to have to accept that people who are arriving after May 2019 will just be covered by exactly the same rules as people who are already
They'll
here,
have to go
surely.
through mandatory registration.
But how will anybody check that if employers can't tell the difference?
Well, employers will be able to evidence whether people have been, if somebody's been through the settled status scheme, they'll be able to evidence that. If somebody hasn't been here prior to the end of March next year, then employers will have to make sure that they go through adequately rigorous checks to evidence somebody's right to work. But I think it is a very fair point that we do not wish to discriminate against people who have every right to be here, who we want to stay, and who we have said very clearly are welcome to stay. Indeed, we recognise that they have played an enormous part both in our economy and our communities. But we want to make sure that we don't discriminate against them, which will indeed pose a challenge to government and indeed to employers in differentiating between those two groups of people.